Hello and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Compliance Week and Skillsoft. I'm Kyle Brasser with Compliance Week and I'll be your host. Today's webcast is adapting your compliance program for the next new normal. Before we hear from our presenters, let me review the agenda. We're scheduled to go for 1 hour. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll pose them to our guests at the end of their presentation. After the Q&A, I'll wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CPE credit for all attendees. Please be sure you are using either Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser and that you have disabled your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. Once I have signed off and the webcast is completely over, the final examination will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcasts@complianceweek.com. Once again, to ensure receipt of your CPE credit, please use either Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser. If you've missed anything, I'll repeat these instructions at the end of the webcast, so stay tuned. A few other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. There you will also find the feedback form for the webcast. We welcome your thoughts as we are always looking to improve your experience. If you wish to increase the slide size, you can also hit the View Slide Full Screen button at the top right of your screen. And lastly, a Help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. I'd like to welcome today's speakers. It is my pleasure to introduce Julia Arbery, a partner with StoneTurn, who assists multinational corporations with the development and implementation of effective ethics and compliance programs and specializes in the establishment of whistleblower frameworks and investigative protocols that comply with global data privacy and protection regulations. We also have Annabel, Kerley, a partner with StoneTurn, having extensive experience in leading complex cross-border investigations into matters involving fraud, bribery, and corruption. She spent 5 years leading regulatory investigations for the Financial Conduct Authority and currently serves as advisor to the Executive Committee of the Association of Corporate Investigators. I'd also like to welcome James Brown, the Group's Legal Director leading Ricoh's legal function in EMEA. Having spent over 9 years with Ricoh, his areas of focus include compliance, ensuring alignment with Ricoh's parent company in Japan, as well as M&A, commercial contracts, and aligning the group legal function with Ricoh's sales strategy. We also have Robert Maddox, Senior Associate at Debevoise in Plimpton. Robert is a member of the firm's data strategy and security practice in London. His work focuses on cybersecurity preparedness, incident response, and regulatory defense, as well as advising on data protection and data strategy issues. It's great to have you all with us today, and with that, I will turn it over to Julia to get us started.
Thank you, Kyle. Very kind of you. We're very pleased that you're hosting us here today. I will be moderating Annabel, James, and Robert throughout the presentation here today, and our focus is going to be really on 3 topics. We will be discussing cybersecurity risks. We will be looking at remote working and what other risks are emerging in the current times. And then we'll be looking ahead to really see, what's happening and where will we be, hopefully, after the pandemic. Robert, in my opinion, it's clear that there are differences from a cybersecurity risk perspective between working from home, as most of us currently are, and the office environment. Do you have some examples that you can share with us today?
Sure, thanks, Julia. So I think one thing to sort of level set is 2020 was undoubtedly a huge year when it came to cybersecurity incidents and cyber risk. And I think to sort of level set, it's important to understand how COVID influenced companies' cyber risk profiles. If we're going to understand then how to deal with that. And I think there are 2 points I'll just highlight. The first is a technical one, and that's really that the rapid increase in surface area that attackers had to target after the shift to remote work, which happened in many cases on a very expedited basis. And that's something that some companies dealt with very well, if they were quite progressive in their remote working and agile working frameworks. But others, to be honest, struggled a little bit, and they, in order to remain operational, actually ended up relaxing their standards. And an example of that in practice that I've come across is, for example, one organization which previously only allowed remote login on company-issued devices, but had to pivot and move away from that rule, allowing individuals to use their own devices. And what that meant was effectively overnight, the visibility that the information security team had into what users were doing and consequently the threat risk profile decreased dramatically. And I think what that means in practice is when we're sort of all said and done with COVID, information security teams would be probably well advised to go back over and look at what they might have missed and revisit these policies and ensure that the security surface area is hardened back to the standards that it was pre-pandemic. I think the second point is really a human one, which is that with all compliance issues, we've got to remember that we're dealing with people at the end of the day. How does that play out with cyber risks that you're talking about, Julia? Well, I think we've seen it with increased phishing attacks and also perhaps an increased propensity for people to fall victim to them. And I think this comes down to really fundamentally a question of vigilance and practicality and the reality surrounding many individuals' remote work from environment, which means people are often less alert, perhaps even than they would be in an office. There are different social cues that mean that we perhaps feel more comfortable in our home environment, that mean we're less vigilant to these sorts of phishing and other cybersecurity threats. And perhaps we do things that we wouldn't normally do had we been sitting in our office. And I think one practical tip I'll just have there is with that sort of new risk is to create increased vigilance and be reminding individuals on an ongoing basis about the need to remain vigilant. Roll out your training, refresh your training, and have it appropriately adapted. So I think those are just a couple of points that I wanted to flag that I've seen play out over the last few months, or much more than that now, in fact. But safe to say that I don't think we've seen the full impact from a cybersecurity perspective yet. Many attacks, as we've seen, for example, with Marriott, go undetected for a number of years. So I think we will see the impact of the rapid move to remote working for quite some time to come.
Thank you, Robert. That's very helpful. I also believe that probably one of the aspects to consider is that maybe a lot of employees don't truly understand the threats, so that may lead to them not necessarily adhering to the security protocols simply because it's still something that additional training may be helpful for.
I think that's fair, and I think oftentimes, for instance, when it comes to phishing, people fall down on two fronts. One, they underestimate just how sophisticated some of the phishing and social engineering attacks have become. You would frankly be hard pressed to tell the difference very often now. And the second point is, I think individuals and employees often underestimate the impact that falling victim to a phishing attack can actually have. And if I think about the sorts of incidents that we've been helping clients with during the pandemic, there's been a huge increase in number of ransomware attacks. And very often we see the initial attack vector wasn't anything particularly stunning from a technical perspective. And actually it often points back to a simple phishing attack.
It's James here. If I could add to that, I think it's a really interesting point because phishing can be so simple. And I think, Robert, one of the key points you made there, you've got the technical side of this problem and also the impact of people. And training does quite rightly sit in the middle of that. And one of the successes I think I've seen in training is you can have generic training where people think it will not happen to them. But actually, when you look at case studies and real things that have happened, you can see the simplicity. And the impact can be huge. Where processes go wrong, if you look at accounts payable, for example, a simple email that has somebody who there's a gap in their process, there might be a manual process, pays 250,000 euros out of a business. If a margin of 25%, the business needs to make $1 million to get back to where it started. So, when you bring that home and show examples, I completely agree with you that the sophistication of hiding things and having emails that look really, really well prepared is something that can be difficult to spot. But I have found that realistic training, rather than the normal flagging risks, but actually here's an example of an email that has led to money going out of the business, has been really effective.
If I could just come in here as well, it's Annabel. I've actually worked on an investigation very recently, and this is probably quite unusual, but it's relevant, I think, where an employee had, over many years, stolen large amounts of money from a company by impersonating various people, both within and without the company. And he is actually potentially going to be using as one of his lines of defence that he was phished. And we're currently, grappling with how we disprove that, because it's actually, from a cyber technical perspective, very difficult to prove an individual over a course of 10 years has never been phished. It's that age-old trying to prove a negative. I appreciate this is probably quite an unusual situation, but it's just another aspect of our conversation about phishing.
It's a good point, Annabel. In terms of practical, what you can do practically about it, I'm not sure how relevant it would be to your investigation, but certainly it is things like the benefits of multi-factor authentication or changing passwords regularly and having discipline and policies around password protection as well. It kind of someone could potentially run that argument with an isolated incident, but you'd think less so over a prolonged period of time.
Yes, indeed, and that is one of the sort of challenges or the counter arguments that we're looking at the moment. Thank you.
I think one point on policies that springs to mind for me is actually just making sure that they apply to everyone. And your point, James, about multi-factor authentication is a fabulous one, because what we have seen is that a lot of organisations have rolled out multi-factor or two-factor authentication for whether it's webmail logins or logins to the remote desktop more broadly. But I'd recommend that companies ask for where were exceptions granted. And if I was a compliance officer or similar, that's one of the questions I'd be asking, because we've seen a number of incidents where you actually find out that the person who got phished successfully because there wasn't multi-factor authentication is someone who's quite senior. And then when you look into it, why wasn't multi-factor authentication enabled on their account? And you actually find out it's because they objected to it, because they felt it was getting in the way of their work. And I think it's making sure that people haven't perhaps misused their position within the business in order to circumvent some of the controls that ultimately are keeping people and the company's information safe.
Thank you, Robert. I think that also leads us on very nicely into the further discussion when we think about how we started 10 months ago, where we basically overnight and without prior warning all had to adjust and make sure that we got home and then stayed home, depending on where we were. When in our different jurisdictions, the rules started to be rolled out around staying at home. For the IT teams, I believe, did an amazing job here, adjusting to this new reality. James, how do you think the guidance has evolved and changed over the last 10 months, and what are some practical considerations?
Yeah, I think first of all, hats off to all teams and IT teams, because I think companies think of business continuity as something that deals with something that happens unexpectedly, but probably not for something that lasts as long as this has. People were very much, I suppose, from an IT perspective, looking at things from the perspective of could our workforce work from home, rather than must our workforce work from home. So I think the guidance has been evolving over time, and obviously Robert, who has spoken previously, has got a lot of experience in cybersecurity, so he will know probably better than many of us just how quickly that moves. Cyber threats, as Robert mentioned, have been the highest in 2020 as people have tried to leverage the pandemic and really find gaps in businesses and take advantage and prey on inefficiencies that may be within companies, organizations, or could be more exploited because of remote working. And absolutely, as we'll come on to talk about, there are more risks emerging from remote work. But I think in terms of what you can do for your company, and for all of our guests listening today, that we will have many different types of companies here of different shapes and sizes. So it is important to be proportionate. The largest sector that was hit by cyber security issues was the financial services industry, and I would anticipate that those kind of organizations will have teams of people perhaps that look after their IT and their IT security. And similarly, we'll have smaller organizations and charities who have got similar concerns but may not have anybody. So I think it is important to be proportionate from a practical perspective. And one of the ways I think you can do something yourself at the most basic level is undertake a risk assessment. So understand what sort of data is in your systems, what levels of security you have from maybe off-the-shelf solutions that you might be running, and look at the commercial sensitivity of the information and data in your systems. And another key focus area, as we've seen the GDPR landscape move, is certainly in respect of personal data, because I think it is important to refresh. We'll have an idea of technical and organizational measures that we use to protect our data, but it'd be very interesting to understand how that translates into the home environment. And again, the example that Robert gave earlier around companies changing their strategy as they go, that's where gaps can emerge. So I think that's a good starting point to help anybody understand what they might need. And then, we've talked about training. I think training, and more importantly, repetitive training, is important. And ordinarily, you would say you should refresh training around holiday periods when, as has been mentioned, senior staff who maybe run processes or are a checkpoint or a point of governance within a process may be on holiday themselves. It is another period of time where cybersecurity risks tend to flag up more. And I think once you've done that, you can get more technical solutions. We've talked about multi-factor authentication. That's something that, to a degree, adds another gateway that's positive to protecting the organization. And to some degree, you could argue might make up for poor password governance, where people might just use a password and a number 1 and a number 2 and a number 3 and a number 4, because they're the sorts of things that can land us in trouble. And some tests that companies can run, you can run to the point earlier around how sophisticated are the phishing emails that might come through. You can absolutely run tests that mock up and look like a real email, and you can see how many members of staff actually clicked on the link or how many recognized that it was an issue and didn't. And I should add, you have to be very careful when you roll those sorts of things out across EMEA. That's definitely something to talk to your HR teams about as well. But it's another point of testing the awareness of your teams. And I would argue that in a remote environment, whilst not trying to confuse everybody and worry everybody when everyone is sparsely populated all over the world, it is a good point to feed back on. And I think once you then get past those steps, you know roughly where you want to go. And I think with cybersecurity and protecting your business, it is absolutely key to have a longer term plan. We are dealing with a point in history at the moment, but any investment you make in your business, you want to obviously see develop. So choosing the right partner and choosing something that is agile enough and can scale as the problem, continues to grow, as it will do, is very important to keep in mind.
Thank you, James. And do you think that we're at a point now where, with the vaccine being rolled out worldwide, we're hoping that there will be some sort of herd immunity in the nearer future? Do you think that this is still the time to continue to invest in more security for remote work?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think as a starting point or a quick answer to your question, I would say yes, it is, in the sense that cybersecurity is an evolving problem, and it can be very lucrative for criminals. That's why they do it. So I don't think it's necessarily a problem that's going to go away. So businesses are always, to varying degrees, going to need to invest in protecting themselves from this risk. But I think what we have seen from the pandemic is a shift in working patterns. Traditional views about working from home that maybe have stopped people working from home have probably been proven either incorrect or softened, more likely. But we are going to see, I suspect, a dilution of time spent in the office. And let's not forget, we are still getting to grips as the world, if you like, to what COVID means on an ongoing basis in terms of social distancing, and that throws up lots of different concerns around use of offices. So I think there is going to be a pattern of working from home that will continue, and some companies, of course, were doing that before. How that plays out, obviously, is to be seen. That is the definition of the new normal. But I do believe that to close the gap, there are more risks with working from home. We've touched on some of them. That if there's more entry points or more risks to the company, more investment is going to need to be made, and more focus will need to be placed on it.
Thank you. That's a very good point. And in terms of the way we see ourselves working, I believe I have seen in my own working from home environment, with my husband working from home and my children schooling from home, that there's the risk of mixing work life and data and everything. If working from home, how do you maintain and ensure a compliant culture, a compliant environment in relation to cybersecurity?
Well, I think I completely agree with you. A household and an office are completely different environments. I think naturally, in a home, there's probably going to be more trust, a more relaxed environment when you've got children and you've got pets, and if you're in house shares, laptops can be used for different things. They could be used for schooling. They could be used for homeschooling, virtual classes. There's all sorts of new things that are going on in the world and in the country at the moment to adapt to the situation that we're in. But the reality is, in an office environment, there is a certain etiquette. If you get up and leave your desk, you should follow good practice and lock your screen, for example. Don't leave papers out on the desk. And they're all good practice things to do. But equally, you are less likely to walk back to your desk when you've had a coffee to find someone else sat tapping away at your laptop. It's almost something that you just don't do. So, you have security passes in an office environment. You have lockers. Whereas in homes, you're less likely to have locked doors. You might not have your own space within which you can work. And even from just a technical safety perspective, if you work in the front room that backs onto the street and you go to bed and leave your laptop there, you're probably more likely to have your laptop stolen from a break-in than perhaps you would do in an ordinary office environment. So I think there are fundamental differences, and I guess the practical solution to that, and everybody's circumstances are different, quite honestly, is to try and get to a situation where you can implement some of those things that I've just mentioned within your home environment.
Thank you, James. Moving on to our next topic, emerging risk areas. Annabel, what do you think are some of the other areas that we should be focusing on in addition to cybersecurity?
Thanks, Julia. I think, where do I start? I think there are plenty. I think on this side, I'll go from right to left, actually. I think harassment could be a serious potential, and actually possibly more serious than in the real world. There's actually some new statistics out today in the UK that in Wales there's been an increase in the number of, a fall in reports of crime overall, but an increase in both fraud offences, which were up 8%, and harassment and stalking reports up 11% overall, and in some areas up 34%. So I think we've even got data now to say that this is happening more rather than less. And I think obviously methods and modes will change, but the problem has grown during the various lockdowns in the various jurisdictions. I think on the face of it, you might think that it's actually less likely, because if you're on a video conference, it could potentially be being recorded. There's likely to be more than just two people on it. So you would think perhaps people would be discouraged or not able to undertake workplace harassment in those kind of situations. But I think the numbers tell a different story. And in terms of what can be done about that, I think it's very challenging actually, because there's less likely to be witnesses if it is just two of you on a call and nothing's been recorded. How are you going to prove that something has happened? Are you going to be more or less likely to report something that has been happened, given that context? I mean, interestingly, I'm certainly hearing from many of my clients around the globe that whistleblowing reports on all manner of issues have gone through the roof. So I think it is actually more likely that potentially people are going to report, perhaps because they feel they're at a physical distance from the individual, even though they're speaking to them virtually. Perhaps it feels a little bit safer to report. I don't know. So I think there's plenty going on around the higher risk and the increased volumes of harassment happening. I don't know if anyone else wants to chip in. If not, I will move on to another area.
I think, Annabel, just from my perspective, James here, I completely agree with you. I think because of the home working, the perception of bullying or harassment or even just anything is going to feel magnified at home. Because, if someone, as you kind of touched on, if someone's going to be the bully, for example, they're not going to do it on email. They're going to do it on a video that leaves no trail. And I think we also need to think of our employees when they are at home. Not everyone lives with anybody else, so there is no one to talk to. And equally, when things go wrong at work or if people make mistakes, if you're in an office environment, you can go into the office the next day and you'll see people walking around, and if you see them smile, you'll probably feel a bit better about yourself, and you can kind of get through things like that. But in such a remote environment, it can very easily lead to emotions spiraling and magnify problems, I think is the summary. So it's a very big problem.
Yeah, absolutely, James. I completely agree. And actually that brings me quite nicely onto sort of the next area, which is the kind of the mental health aspects of working from home. I think there are people, it's been nearly a year now for many, many people where, the added anxiety, the added stress of homeschooling and, caring and just, everything. And I know many, many people I speak to are working harder than ever, which, on the one hand, it's wonderful that people have, in certain industries aren't losing their jobs, but at the same time, people are not only not able to delineate because they're in the same building for both work and home. There's no commute downtime in which to switch off and make that transition from work to home. I think there's a really serious problem with sort of burnout, remote working burnout. I mean, I personally, after a day on Zoom calls, quite often have to lie down in a darkened room for a few minutes just to sort of switch off from constant screen burn, I suppose, to my eyes. And I think, on a more positive note, there are things you can do about that, quite practical things. I think we'd start with setting the tone around that. So if senior management and middle management can really set, insofar as possible, a tone of sort of support and, not having too high, through the roof expectations, and giving, understanding the kind of position people are in and the times they might have to be working. So just setting a kind of understanding and supportive tone from the top. I think then that can filter down into all sorts of more kind of day-to-day practical steps around, say, having Friday being a no camera day. You just don't have your camera on unless you absolutely have to, if it's a client meeting maybe. Encouraging people to just take their holidays, even though they can't go somewhere exotic, they can still have a break. And check-ins, I think those can happen in lots of different ways. You can have you go to your employees informally and have a virtual coffee, or you can hold a surgery where people can sort of come to you if they've got something particular to raise. I also know that some organisations do a mental health first aid training, which trains individuals to notice and more importantly, how to respond and help when they identify that one of their team is facing mental health issues. So I think, just to answer your question, Julia, there are many, many facets to the emerging risk areas. Those are sort of two that I wanted to talk about in a bit more detail.
Thank you very much, Annabel. I think you raised a really good point here. And I've also viewed and observed and heard that there's generally this feeling of exhaustion that employees are dealing with. And there was a recent survey conducted last month by 3GEM where they identified that staff is feeling overworked. They worry about not being paid overtime. They're anxious and stressed. So that's a very, very good point that you made there.
Thank you.
So if we want to move on and look into the future, what are everyone's thoughts in relation to what does the future of work look like?
It's James here. I'm happy to kick off. I think looking at that diagram, it's not something that surprises me. I think it's probably fairly accurate, actually. And I think we're all trying to define the new normal and what the new normal is. And personally, for me, it feels like a rainbow that you keep getting close to and it just bounces away. If you'd asked me, I think I was telling my team in October that, things are rosy, the daily cases are reducing, the vaccination's on its way, we should be, approaching the new normal, whatever that may be shortly, and then obviously things change. So we are living in a very uncertain time, but what this graphic shows is I think role dependent as well. I think we've got to look at industry sectors, we've got to look at specific roles because some are purely office based, some are manufacturing, and some companies can facilitate remote working. The point about this, maybe a point for discussion, is my experience with this is when you engage teams to discuss this as to what will the new normal be, there's a lot of discussion that is focused on how much time you'll have out of the office. We're talking about a work-life balance, but the focus is not how many days you're going to be in the office, it's how many days you're going to be out of the office. And that almost sets the view that it's better to be out of the office. And obviously we have been out of the office for quite a considerable period of time now. But I think when you look at it from the different perspectives, from a company's perspective, having teams in the office is absolutely brilliant for engagement. It's fantastic for building and sustaining a culture as one develops or continues. We shouldn't forget about new starters who join companies. It is very challenging to join a new company virtually and get into a team. And so it definitely helps with that. I think one of the other things that's probably common between a lot of people listening in today and our companies are the alignment between teams. You have different functions, but you can't underestimate the value of the small conversations of where you learn about a business update or something that might be relevant to something that you're doing and aligning yourself with the direction of your business and following that strategy. But from the employee's perspective, I think on a personal level, it is shown, and Annabel touched on this really, really well, in terms of well-being. Seeing people is important, and engaging with your team, seeing friends is great for engagement as well. Moving about, I used to complain I'd say like most of us, if not all of us, used to complain about our commute, and after a couple of months we started to see the value of what that commute did for our life and our ability to decompress or process the day, think about what we might be doing next, and having a formal start and stop to the day. So I absolutely think it will be hybrid, and I think this has shown that it is possible. We don't have to lose efficiency if we find the right balance, but the conversation around it and how we get there is an interesting one.
I completely agree, James, and I think it's also the considerations that need to be considered is not just, it is possible to work from home. We see we can make it work, but what is it maybe in the interest of our workforce, our teams, and as we mentioned earlier, there's a health and safety concern about those that are fairly lonely working from home and do not have that engagement.
It's Robert here, Julia. I fully agree. I think organisations need to think carefully as time goes on about what their liability or responsibility is to their employees when you have people who are working from home who either only did so on an ad hoc basis previously or not at all. And if we think very practically speaking, companies invest huge amounts in office space, office furniture, office lighting, and so on. And it's not just to make the office look pretty, of course. It's to protect employees' health, well-being, and as a byproduct of that, inevitably, productivity. And I think we'll all have probably heard stories about people perhaps being told, no, you can't go into the office and remove your desk chair, and then a week later someone is off sick with a bad back or terrible neck pain. So I think it's going to require companies to revisit just how much investment they have to make, not only in their in-office working environment, but to what extent do they need to be subsidising and supporting individuals to make sure that they have I suppose, a safe and comfortable working environment outside of the office, whilst appreciating that won't be possible for everyone, and in certain industries it's not possible at all, perhaps. This doesn't apply if you're working on the floor of a manufacturing plant. There are different challenges there, of course. But for office workers, I think this is a potential source of liability and significant responsibility going forwards. Yeah.
I think if I can introduce a slightly different tilt on the discussion, I think the other thing that companies really need to consider is the risk of discrimination. Not all of us, none of us are in the same boat for this pandemic storm, and I think those with caring responsibilities will be finding it much harder, and those pre-existing gender inequality issues are exacerbated hugely by the pandemic, and I think we're going to be losing years and years of progress towards parity. And I'm just going to, there was a McKinsey article published recently, and I'll just read out a quote. In a gender regressive scenario that they ran, in which no action is taken to counter the effects of inequalities being exacerbated, they estimate that the global GDP growth could be 1 trillion lower than it would have been otherwise in 2030, than if women's unemployment simply tracked that of men in each sector. So I think just the economic impact of that discrimination is also huge, and at a company level and an individual level, it's something we all need to notice, acknowledge, and try and do something about.
Thank you, Annabel. Yeah, that's a really good point that you just made in relation to the discrimination also now being maybe going backwards again based on our current situation. From a practical point of view, James, if we're looking at new ways of working, and this may be different depending on each organization, what kind of hybrid model they will be looking at in the future, what are the first things that need to be renewed and updated, and maybe completely new policies that need to be addressed from an organizational perspective?
I think one of the key areas to probably start here is you've got to consider why you're amending your policies, and they should really be following a flow of what you're doing in your business. Certainly, one of the things that you will all be facing is the return to the office. So in that respect, making sure that your office is COVID secure is a process that we will all work through if we haven't done so already. And that will probably impact your policies, because generally we might impact policies because they're driven by change. We might change our policies because it's driven by cost saving, or we might change our policies because of addressing risk. And the reason why I start with the office is because I think one of the biggest changes that we'll see is with the fact that our office capacity may well reduce. And this is something actually Ricoh's been doing, and we've been doing for some time now, is doing the risk assessment of your office and then understanding which of your desks can be utilised and which of your desks can't be utilised to sustain social distancing. And then you need to be able to manage to that. And we use an application that we developed called Ricoh Spaces, which is great for mapping the floor plan, and then employees can effectively log desks at points in times and in days. So you have control of your office environment. And the reason why I mention that is because that will then drive probably your agile working policy, as you will want to develop that to see what it looks like. So I think developing an agile working policy has to be done against the direction within which your company is moving. And similarly, your information security policies, your data breach policies, your home worker policies are probably all going to be adjusted as well, to adapt to more of a working from home. How does your IT security stretch into the home working environment? How do you maintain your agility? And the business will build around that. I think we'll get more remote working enablement. Remote process automation is another aspect that's really key to efficiency and driving efficiency and closing those gaps actually that can fester when we have people all over the place. So I think definitely they're the policies that I would focus on. There's also the other policies, and Annabel touched on this. Don't forget the people here. Don't forget well-being. I really do believe that historically, we all go to work, we'll have tasks to do and teams to work within. And you see someone in the office and you're like, they're there, therefore they should be doing this piece of work. But actually, if anything that's come out of this, and we see our team members as individuals and people, I think I spent so much time at the beginning of the pandemic just on Teams calls to make sure people were okay in the circumstances that they were in. Yet when you're in the office, you just assume they're okay because they happen to turn up and be in the office. So your home worker policies, but also your well-being policies, health and safety policies are all going to be important. And I think the final thing I'll say on this, to give the others a chance to speak as well, is just in terms of our, from a sales organisation, or if you're a customer, don't forget that everyone is going to have their own policies. And we've seen so much discrepancy across different countries, and across governments, across initiatives of how to deal with COVID and with the restrictions. Companies will not all be aligned with their policies. And so if you are used to going to see a customer or used to a salesperson coming to see you, we are going to need to build flexibility into how we do that, because we're going to need to respect each other's way of doing things and each other's office space as well. So I think that's some of the practical work that I've certainly been involved with.
That's brilliant. Thank you, James. Robert, from a legal perspective, is there anything that you think should be added?
I think not so much from a legal perspective per se, but I think it's worth noting that I think companies can use the future hybrid working model to achieve pre-existing goals that they've maybe fallen short on previously. So, for example, if we think about many organisations considering ESG-related issues, looking at their environmental impact, their carbon footprint, and again, it's sector specific. But if you're in the services industry, corporate travel might be one of the largest contributors to your carbon footprint as an organisation. And seeing how you can use our newfound learnings around using video conferences to connect and things like that as a way to reduce corporate travel. And we've seen some clients and organisations that we don't work with already making quite bold statements about how they're going to try and use the new ways that we've learned to work to help meet their climate goals. And those aren't necessarily climate-related goals that are imposed upon them by law or regulation. Those are sort of self-governance regimes that companies have chosen to impose upon themselves. So I think there are certainly some opportunities. I think another point is perhaps surrounding diversity inclusion, and this links in with what Annabel was saying. I think just having to, as we move forward, as we've done already, just impress on staff the need to understand the diversity of situations that individuals find themselves in, and appreciate the pressures that each and every one of us suffer. And I think on the return to work, it might be that certain individuals who are high risk, depending on the efficacy of vaccines and the like, aren't actually able to return to work on the same schedule as others. And I think organisations need to make sure that they have appropriate policies and procedures in place that allow them to offer reasonable accommodations if a small group of people are unable to return to work for whatever reason, but can continue to work remotely. How do you ensure that those people, you foster an inclusive environment for those individuals going forward? So lots of challenges and lots of things to think about, but also some opportunities as well.
Thank you, Robert. That's great.
I was just going to add, Julia, sorry. One of the things that I was thinking about, and it goes back to Robert's point right at the beginning about going back over things. So the compliance environment, the systems and controls have been stress tested to the max in the last year, and they've also had to, as we've all said, adapt quickly. So I think that presents, in this new hybrid world we're going to be facing soon, an opportunity to learn the lessons from that and take the good and leave the bad. But also a caveat, I think, comes with that, which is, have you got a log and an inventory of what you did have to change, what you had to switch off, and therefore what you need to switch back on? I do have some clients who have forgotten that they turned off certain monitoring systems that now need to be switched back on, and some retrospective monitoring and auditing needs to happen on those. So yeah, it's bringing the best of what we learned, but also just checking we haven't missed anything when we do start to enter this new hybrid world.
Completely agree, Annabel. And I think it's also, where maybe 10 months ago the situation was considered to be unique and new, and there may have been some leniency from regulators, we're probably now looking into a situation where it's considered to be, as we said, the new normal, and now we need to continue to adapt to the ongoing changes depending on jurisdiction and industry that we're in. So I would suggest that we move on to questions and answers to give the audience some time to respond to their questions, unless anyone else wants to make an additional point.
All right. I think with that said, Julia, I'll take over and we can do some question and answer here. Once again, to the audience, if you would like a copy of the slides that were just presented, you can download it from the drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So let's move on to the Q&A part of our session here, and I will read these questions from the audience in no particular order. This first question, I'll direct it toward Robert. Should the training of employees be modified for a permanent hybrid environment?
I think the answer is a simple yes from me. I think very practical steps that wouldn't have occurred to people previously perhaps need to be communicated to the workforce. If you think about confidentiality of information, a tip that we've certainly been imparting on clients and applying to ourselves is smart speakers and the like. You're on work calls, let's just turn them off. We're all well aware of scandals surrounding smart devices that said they weren't recording conversations, actually having recorded conversations and the like, without wanting to name names, of course. But absolutely, I think we need to be communicating these new, very practical tips to individuals. You live in a shared home environment. Use headphones for calls. Don't say the name of the client on a call. Really impressing upon people good confidentiality hygiene, I think, as much as technical controls, is going to be something that training needs to cover if we're going to continue working remotely in a hybrid model.
All right, thank you, Robert. And we'll move on to the next question here, which I will direct toward James. Are you finding any trends in corporations and companies updating policies in the specific areas relating to the emerging risk areas? Or are you finding companies using communications and training as their approach to addressing these risk areas in a remote work environment?
Yeah, I thought this is an excellent question, actually, because I'm not aware of trends as such, but obviously different companies do things in different ways. But I think this is one where companies can really be creative, actually. There's a number of different ways that you can share policies with people. But I think I'm a lawyer, and I love to believe that when I deploy a new policy, it's the first thing that everyone's going to want to read. But I think the sad reality is that that's probably not the case. So the key point is finding how to make the key messages land so that people are aware. And that is, again, is one of the key problems with, or challenges, let's say, to working from home or remote working. So I think it's always good, firstly, to consider the scope. You know, if you're deploying a policy in an office or across a business in a country or across a business across jurisdictions, because that will have you will need to take different approaches due to the different laws, the different customs and things that are involved. But at the same time, the different channels you've got, you can deploy things on the intranet, you can send things by email, you can have managers. Cascade training is sometimes for a bit more, if you want a more specific approach to a certain issue that you want to share. And then when I think of remote working, you can be creative, and the suggestion I'm going to make is not creative. That's why I'm not a creative person. But mouse maps, if there are key messages, kind of the point Annabel just made actually about, the key things that people forget, maybe send all your employees printed mouse maps. It's not the worst idea in the world, because at least you know that something's getting through. And one thing that I find, experience from Ricoh is the channels and communication from the board all the way down are extremely open. And they do these things called town halls where everyone can dial in and they update us on the state of the business and on what we're doing, and key messages from lines of business or compliance. They get really good uptake because people are interested in what's going on. And it's a great way to communicate. So I think that the answer to that question is, do what's right for your business, but don't do it once. Take advantage of all the channels that are open to you.
All right, thank you, James. And we'll move on to the next question here. And this one's directed toward Robert. You mentioned increased cyber risk due to how employees are working now. Companies now make more extensive use of contractors. In the gig economy, these contractors may be working for several companies. How does this complexity affect cyber risk?
Great, really great question. I think it undoubtedly increases your cyber risk profile unless appropriately managed. And it goes back to this this point I was sort of touched upon a little bit earlier, which is your surface area that you could be attacked through just increases. And using the analogy, it's much easier to protect a single castle than it is to protect a series of small forts. And the way you protect your business, if it's a series of small forts or a very large number of small forts, has to be different to if you're protecting a castle. What that means in practice is making sure that you know your vendors, you know your contractors, and you actually diligence them. I think we've seen a shift over the last 18 months or so from, for instance, securing audit rights in a contract to actually really being expected to exercise those audit rights over cybersecurity issues. For instance, if we're talking about a large vendor or contractor, but if we're talking about a diverse group of individuals, it's much harder. But I think it's about bringing those individuals that into the fold and treating them as if they were really part of your organization and not differentiating in terms of your technical expectations for how they work with your organization or your behavioral expectations. And I think applying things equally to them is the way to go. But it certainly increases risk, and I think it increases the degree of oversight that you have to devote to these issues if you are going to have information and access to your systems more widely dispersed than you would otherwise.
All right, thank you, Robert. And we have time for one last question, real quick for James. What are some effective ways I can gather employee input as I develop my return to office plan?
This is a great question, actually a really interesting question, because I think it's almost what not to do rather than, or things to consider, put it that way. The return to the office plan is important. There's going to be a lot of moving parts. You might be thinking about, do you have a rota for certain teams, or do certain teams come in on different days of the week, and which teams need to complement each other? It is absolutely something that needs to be well communicated as a plan, and consistent communication is key. The moment the consistency is lost, everybody notices. So I think, choose your path, and I think whenever you're embarking on this type of project, which we all will do, accept that it's a journey, but it's important for the company to have a sensible starting position. My word of caution, I think, and this touches back to the point I made before of where people's perceptions can often go, is involve and consult. And I think it's good for managers to be able to do that with their team. But don't create a free-for-all. I think the company needs to make a decision of what fits best to get the collaboration and driving the strategy that the business is going for, rather than taking into everybody's individual circumstances and individual views. That's really where the agile working policy comes in, and that's where we consider what we can do. But in terms of going back, as we've said, to that start of how do I gather input, I would suggest a good opportunity is through line managers. You could do things like SurveyMonkey or equivalents like that. But my overarching point, consultancy is important, but don't give freedom of choice. It needs to be a balance.
All right, and thank you, James. And with that, we will wrap up the Q&A session. Thank you to the audience for the questions asked. Those questions that we were not able to get to, we will look to follow up with you directly. Again, everyone, our speakers today were Julia Arbery, Annabel Kerley, James Brown, and Robert Maddox. And I'd like to give a special thanks to Skillsoft for making this webcast possible. Once again, to obtain your CPE credit for this presentation, please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. The webcast will close automatically, and the final examination will be presented as a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcast@complianceweek.com. This webcast has been recorded and will be available later today to Compliance Week members on our website under the Webcast tab, which also contains a library of additional CPE webcasts. If you would like to learn more about becoming a member, please contact us at info@complianceweek.com. This concludes our webcast. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.